In the summer of 1891, a crew of drainage workers cutting through the wet clay earth of Saginaw County, Michigan, pulled something out of the ground that should have changed everything we know about who built this continent. They were ordinary men, labourers hired to dig drainage channels through the lowland marshes of the Saginaw Valley, rerouting water so farmers could expand their fields. Nobody expected to find anything down there except mud and roots and the occasional buried log. But at a depth of roughly 12 feet, one of the crew's shovels struck something solid. They cleared away the sediment, and what emerged from that black Michigan clay was a human skull so large that a grown man could fit both of his fists inside the eye socket. If you've never heard this story, that's not an accident. If you want to understand who really built the ancient infrastructure of North America, why the Great Lakes region is saturated with anomalous archaeological finds that never make it into textbooks, and what the Smithsonian Institution has been doing with evidence like this for over 100 years, stay with this video. Because the Saginaw find is not a myth. It was reported in newspapers, it was witnessed by multiple people, and then, like so many discoveries of its kind, it was quietly absorbed into a system designed to make sure you never ask the right questions. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of history they don't teach you in school, subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. We cover the buried record of a civilization that predates the official timeline, and there's a lot more coming that you need to see. The Saginaw Valley in the late 19th century was undergoing rapid agricultural transformation. The region sits in the heart of the Michigan Lower Peninsula, drained by the Saginaw River and its tributaries, surrounded by what had once been dense swampland. Settlers had been pushing into this territory for decades, and by 1891 the drive to convert wetlands into productive farmland was in full force. That meant drainage projects. Crews of labourers were hired to dig trenches, lay tile, and redirect the natural flow of water across thousands of acres of low-lying ground. These men were not archaeologists. They were not academics. They were workers, and when they hit something unexpected in the ground, their first instinct was to dig it out and see what it was. The bones they recovered that day were not ordinary. The skull alone, described by witnesses present at the site, was of extraordinary dimensions. Contemporary accounts put it at roughly 3 times the size of a modern adult male skull. The jaw was intact enough to show teeth still seated in the bone, teeth that witnesses said were double-rowed with an upper and lower set, unlike anything they had seen before. The post-cranial bones recovered alongside the skull, fragments of femur and what appeared to be portions of a shoulder girdle were proportionally massive. Estimates based on the recovered material placed the original individual at somewhere between 9 and 10 feet in standing height. Local newspapers picked up the story. This is important because it establishes a contemporaneous paper trail. The find was not invented decades later by amateur historians on the internet. It was reported in print in 1891, in an era when regional newspapers covered unusual local events with genuine journalistic interest rather than reflexive dismissal. The Saginaw Morning Herald and other regional papers of the period ran coverage of the drainage crew's discovery. The bones were described, the site location was noted, and the discovery was treated as a genuine archaeological anomaly warranting attention. What happened next follows a pattern so consistent across North American giant discoveries of the 19th century that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence. Representatives arrived. In some accounts, it is a representative of a scientific institution, in others a government agent, in still others simply a well-dressed man who arrived quickly and spoke with authority. The bones were taken, transported, catalogued, presumably shipped to a larger institution for study. And then the record goes quiet. This is the mechanism, this is how it works. Not through dramatic suppression or burning of evidence in the dead of night, but through the far more effective process of institutional absorption. A discovery gets made, it gets reported locally, and then it enters the custody of a body like the Smithsonian Institution, an organization that has been the designated repository for North American archaeological materials since its founding in 1846. Once inside that system, the material either gets reclassified, gets stored in a way that makes public access practically impossible, or simply vanishes from the catalogued record entirely. The Smithsonian's own internal correspondence from the Bureau of Ethnology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries references hundreds of giant skeletal finds from across the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys, the Great Lakes Basin, and the Atlantic seaboard. Researchers like Vine Deloria Jr., a Native American scholar and activist who was not given to conspiracy theorizing, documented the systematic discrepancy between field reports of unusual skeletal material and the Smithsonian's published findings. The field reports describe giants. The published science does not. Something is happening in that gap. To understand why the Saginaw find matters specifically and why Michigan matters as a location, you need to understand the geography of this region from the perspective of alternative history and what the Tartaria research community has been putting together over the last decade. The Great Lakes Basin is one of the most anomalous regions on the North American continent when you look at it through the lens of pre-reset civilization. The lakes themselves are massive, connected, and form a natural inland sea system that gives direct water access from the Atlantic through the St. Lawrence into the heart of the continent. Anyone who controlled or inhabited this waterway system would have commanded extraordinary strategic and logistical power. The Saginaw Valley sits at the western edge of this system. Saginaw Bay opens directly onto Lake Huron. Whatever civilization was moving through the Great Lakes was moving through here. The Tartaria framework, for those new to this research, examines evidence for a highly advanced global civilization that existed prior to a major civilizational reset event, likely in the 18th or early 19th century. This civilization, associated with the Tartarian Empire documented on historical maps that were systematically removed from educational curricula after the reset, possessed advanced construction technology, sophisticated energy and architectural knowledge, and a global population of builders whose physical characteristics may have differed significantly from what we see today. The giant skeletal record fits this framework in a way that is difficult to explain otherwise. Finds of oversized human remains are not isolated to one region or one time period. They have been documented from burial mounds across the Ohio Valley, from the caves of Lovelock in Nevada, from the Channel Islands off California, from the mounds of Wisconsin and Illinois, and from the drainage ditches and construction excavations of Michigan. The distribution follows a pattern consistent with a widespread ancient population. A population that was here before the official history begins, that built the mound complexes and the earthwork systems, and possibly the megalithic structures whose origins conventional archaeology still cannot satisfactorily explain, and that was subsequently erased from the record. The Michigan mound builders are themselves a subject of deep institutional controversy. The state contains hundreds of burial and effigy mounds, many excavated in the 19th century, before any systematic protocols existed. Material recovered includes not only standard burial goods, but anomalous skeletal material and copper objects worked with a precision that does not match any known indigenous metalworking tradition of the region. The Lake Superior copper culture extracted enormous quantities of pure copper from the Keweenaw Peninsula over thousands of years, leaving evidence of industrial-scale mining with no satisfactory explanation for where all that extracted copper actually went. The quantities mined vastly exceed what the local archaeological record can account for. Put these pieces together, a region with massive ancient mining infrastructure, burial mounds containing anomalous remains, newspaper-documented giant skeletal discoveries, and an institutional framework that has consistently failed to produce those skeletons for public examination. The Saginaw skull is not a curiosity. It is evidence of the people who were actually here. Consider what a 9-foot human being implies architecturally. Doorways scaled to modern proportions become laughably small for a person of that stature. Load-bearing requirements, the physical labor of moving stone and earth, all of it transforms when you scale the workforce up by a factor of 2 in linear dimension. Researchers in the Tartaria community have noted that certain megalithic structures, with block weights and tolerances that modern engineering would struggle to replicate, make considerably more sense when you imagine them built by beings of significantly larger physical scale. Not lost technology in the science fiction sense, just larger, stronger people applying the same basic principles of manual labor, but doing so with bodies capable of generating proportionally greater force. The mud flood hypothesis adds another layer. The theory holds that a massive geological or atmospheric event deposited thick sediment layers across much of the northern hemisphere, burying lower portions of existing structures and resetting the visible surface of civilization. The fact that the 1891 crew found their skull at 12 feet below grade fits this model precisely. 12 feet of sediment accumulation in a low-lying riverine environment like the Saginaw Valley is not geologically outlandish, and if the person whose skull they found died before the reset event, the depth of burial makes immediate sense. What also fits this model is the landscape-level infrastructure of the Great Lakes Basin itself. The geometric earthworks whose true scale only becomes apparent from aerial survey. The elevated embankment settlers assumed were natural features, all pointing to a civilization that engineered this hydrology at a scale the 1891 drainage crew, fumbling through the remnants with hand tools, could not even conceptualize. The question of what the Smithsonian has actually done with material recovered from sites like Saginaw is one researchers have pursued through Freedom of Information Act requests and archival cross-referencing of field notes against published catalogues. What they consistently find is absence. The paper trail of receipt exists in fragments. The bones themselves do not. The pattern of acquisition without publication, material entering the system and not emerging in any form accessible to independent researchers, is documented, and it is real. This is not speculation about shadowy figures making conspiratorial decisions. The simpler explanation is bureaucratic and ideological. The foundational narrative of American prehistory holds that the continent was populated by waves of migration across the Bering Land Bridge, and that complex civilization here did not predate accepted timelines. That narrative has enormous institutional investment behind it. Careers, departments, funding streams, textbook editions, museum displays, all of it depends on that narrative holding. An intact 9-foot human skull from a Michigan drainage ditch is not a minor anomaly to be quietly integrated into the existing framework. It is a framework-ending object. The people who received it understood that, whether they articulated it to themselves in those terms or not. The workers who found it went back to digging drainage channels. The newspapers ran their stories and moved on to the next edition. The skull went wherever skulls like it go. And the Saginaw Valley continued producing its corn and its sugar beets, and the official history of Michigan continued to say that the most notable ancient inhabitants of the region were standard-sized people who built modest mounds and fished the rivers. But the record exists. The newspaper accounts are real. The pattern of similar finds across hundreds of sites and more than a century of documentation is real. And the framework that explains all of it, the existence of a prior civilization of large, capable, architecturally sophisticated people who were here before the reset, whose presence was systematically erased from the institutional record, and whose bones still occasionally emerge from the Michigan clay when a shovel hits something 12 feet down. That framework is becoming harder and harder for serious researchers to dismiss. The next time you drive through the Saginaw Valley, look at the flatness of the land, the way the fields stretch out in almost geometric regularity, the low ridgelines and subtle earthworks that most people drive past without seeing. Someone made this landscape. Someone was here for a very long time before the history books say anyone was here. And in 1891, for one strange afternoon in a muddy drainage cut in Saginaw County, Michigan, a crew of laborers looked at someone in the face. What happened to that skull is the question. What happened to everything like it is the larger one? And if those questions matter to you, you already know what that means about the history you were taught and the history that's still waiting to be recovered. This channel is going to keep pulling on these threads. If you found this video through a search or a recommendation, subscribe now. There are finds like this one across every state in the Great Lakes region, and we have not come close to covering all of them. Share this video with anyone you know who's still operating on the standard timeline. The map of what was really here is much larger and much stranger than they were told, and it starts in places exactly like a drainage ditch in Michigan in the summer of 1891.